Did you know that the United States Marine Corps is actually older than the country it serves? Joining us today is Major General Jason Bohm. Jason served in the United States Marine Corps for 34 years, holding positions such as Inspector General of the Marine Corps, Commanding General of the Marine Corps Recruiting Command, and as Chief of Staff of the Naval Striking and Support Forces for NATO. He is also the author of Washington's Marines, The Origin of the Corps and the American Revolution, which will be linked in the description below. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below and comment your thoughts on this episode or anything you'd like to see me discuss in the future. Enjoy the episode. I'd like to start off with a quote of yours from the opening of your book. And when people say like stuff like this, it's preaching to the choir. This is something that I find incredibly important. But the quote reads, "The further removed our citizens become from the trying and uncertain days of the American Revolution, the less they appreciate the sacrifice, dedication, and perseverance required to continue maintaining these freedoms." So, can you speak to this importance of studying, remembering, and appreciating not just history, but specifically the American Revolution and all these brave men and women, these regular town folk who answered the call of duty to throw off the chains of tyranny and forge a new nation, which would then go on to become the greatest country in the history of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. You just said it very well. We are the greatest country in the world's history, and that did not come easy. We had to fight to throw off the shackles of oppression, and that was a long, protracted 8-year war in which we went from being 13 independent and parochial colonies to having to unify us into a united states, no longer colonies, and be able to take on the most powerful military force in the world. No easy task, particularly because we had no army, no navy, no marines. Once April 19th happened in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, and we found ourselves thrust into an unexpected war. Or you could say expected war, but not at that particular moment. And so the Continental Congress was not in a position to be able to really establish the Army, the Navy, or the Marine Corps, and they actually dragged their feet on that for a little bit of time, and really having to create a country from scratch. So why I made that quote in there is because Americans today, many Americans today, really take our freedoms and our liberties for granted without really understanding what it took in order to establish this country. And before we could really establish the country, we needed to provide the Continental Congress with a secure enough environment in which they could create a government and then allow the governance, our economics, our communications, our economy to be able to start to flourish to build us into what we are today, to allow us to be able to have the time and the bandwidth to be able to write first the Declaration of Independence, declaring to the world why it was that we were going against our mother country, and then the Constitution of the United States, which is as relevant today as it was back in 1787 when it was first drafted. So, why is this important and why is the history important? First and foremost, because to use the age old adage of those who don't remember their history are condemned to repeat it. We never want to find ourselves again in a position where we have an oppressive government that is taking away the free will of the people, the freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, freedom of speech, and all the other freedoms that our forefathers fought so hard to first win and then to preserve over the last 250 years. In order to do that, you need people that will selflessly step forward and be counted. People that are willing to put the greater good before themselves, to put their country and their countrymen before their own personal interest. And then, in addition to that, we need the political will to follow through with something as difficult as winning one's independence from an oppressive government. As I mentioned, an 8-year war and building a nation that didn't exist from scratch, literally building the airplane as we were flying it, That takes enormous political will on the part of General Washington, on the Continental Congress, in the state governments, and the military personnel who were often asked to fight without pay, without resources, without food, and still persevere and be able to follow through to achieve that desired strategic end that we had in common across those 13 unified colonies that then became one unified country. And that's really what the final point is that's required. And that's a long term strategic plan or a vision for the nation of what we want to be, what we can become, what we're willing to sacrifice all to fight for. And we've lost that in a lot of respects over the last 250 years. And I think you're part of what you're seeing with this most current election and the results of the election is a groundswell of Americans looking to get back to the roots and the Christian values and conservative views that have been required to establish this nation and defend it for these last years.
100%, absolutely. And I think that that American spirit that we can achieve whatever we set our minds to, that was manifest in the American Revolution. I think that spirit is still alive in America today. And you say, over the last 250 years, we've sort of lost that a little bit. But with this last election, I think we see a flicker of that spirit still there, and we can forge the best path forward. We can, through our iron will, that American spirit, we can still create the conditions of what America should be and what we want it to be. But this is something I find so admirable about, specifically about the American Revolution and these men and women who answered the call of duty. These people were regular town folk. I mean, they were butchers, they were carpenters, they were merchants. We didn't have a standing army. I mean, we had a couple experienced soldiers from the French and Indian War, but when it came time to throw off these chains of tyranny and get rid of this oppressive regime, this monarchy that was oppressing the Americas, these people answered the call of duty to fight this brutal 8-year war. Can you speak to that and sort of that American spirit?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you part of the reason that we got to that point. This wasn't something that happened overnight. It actually started at the tail end of the French and Indian War, which concluded in 1763, which really established Great Britain as the predominant superpower in the area. We still had France up in Canada, but they were forced out, and the Brits took over Canada, and we had some Spanish influence down around Florida. But generally speaking, Great Britain assumed control of the North American continent. But that came at a great cost, and that cost was economic, resulted in high taxes in England. In fact, English citizens were paying far higher taxes than the colonists were in America. We only paid 1/20th of the taxes that Great Britain was paying back in the home islands. And in addition to paying less taxes, there were 10,000 British troops that were left in America to defend the colonies now, because you still had French and Spanish out there that hoped to someday regain the lost territory that they lost in the French and Indian War. And it costs a lot of money to have a 10,000 man army stationed overseas. So the British started to increase the taxes, and they thought it would only be fair that the Americans pay more of the price for their own defense in the eyes of the British. But what they did was they also started changing the laws in order to fill the pockets of British aristocrats at the risk of American businessmen who were trying to make their own well being as well. And because that had not happened up to this point, America, the colonies had been in place for over a century, independently operating, Britain giving them lots of latitude in order to make a life for themselves and to etch out a lifestyle and a culture and an economy out of the wilderness. And they did that very effectively. until the British started to put more oppressive laws into place to basically bleed off the resources of the Americans and make them pay, again, a larger percentage of the cost of defending the colonies. The Americans tried to uh, work with the British government. In fact, the British government repealed several of these laws they put in place. For example, the Stamp Act of 1765. But eventually, the powers that be in Great Britain thought that the colonists were asking too much. They were being too rebellious. They sent occupying forces over to New England, Boston specifically, and things just continued to fester from there until we had the conflict that began with the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. What I will say, though, to your point about this swell of patriotism, if you will, that we're starting to see raised in the nation today. I do want to say that although our founding fathers and American citizens at the time were willing to sacrifice all to win our freedom and our independence, that that generation uh, still manifests itself today in what we call our all volunteer force. And the all volunteer force came into existence in 1973. In post Vietnam, Richard Nixon was president at the time, and he did away with the draft, the conscription of American forces who were then fighting in Vietnam. The time was right to do that, and we went with an all volunteer force now that requires our recruiters to go out there and find the young men and women who have the mental, moral, and physical abilities to be able to serve honorably in our armed services. And that model works. It's expensive, but it works. And I will tell you, having served as the former commanding general of Marine Corps Recruiting Command, those young men and women are out there today amongst our communities that are just as willing to serve our country and to put others and our great country before self than those who enlisted initially in 1775.
I think that's a very important point. Having an all volunteer military force, I think, is one of the reasons we have the most powerful military in the world. Is America one of the only countries that has an all volunteer military?
Yeah, several nations in the world still have conscription and required military service for all the right reasons. But normally, those conscription periods are limited, a year to 2 years to 3 years. You can only increase your level of proficiency so much during that time frame, particularly with all the emergent technologies today and what it takes to train and educate our military forces. So, again, our model works. It works for us. It's an American model, and having served 34 years in uniform, I could tell you I'd much rather fight beside someone who has voluntarily stepped forward to serve honorably than somebody who's being told to, or somebody who's just being hired to, because I'm not sure where their loyalties lie, but I'm absolutely sure where an all volunteer force loyalty lies.
Yeah, 100%. That definitely would manifest on the battlefield. People who actually want to be there, people who love their country, people who are there to defend and protect those freedoms as opposed to just basically hired guns, I guess. But I mean, first of all, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service, 34 years serving your country. You've obviously had a very illustrious career as a Marine, but have you always been interested in history or was this something you sort of developed along the path?
Yeah, actually, it started in third grade for me. I used to go to my school library, my elementary school, and I would go to the oversized book section. And there was an American history book on the Civil War there by American Heritage. And this had great overhead imagery of the major battles of the Civil War that were paintings that depicted the key elements of the battle with a key that would describe what was going on. So that was my first interest in the military at all. But then I quickly, while still in grade school there, picked up and read the first book cover to cover I ever read was called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And it was about the Jimmy Doolittle raid following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, in which we put medium Army bombers on an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, and flew them to bomb Tokyo and other cities inside of Japan. What a bold and heroic and innovative move on the part of the United States to say, yeah, you may have given us a bloody nose, but stand by because we're coming back and we're opening up a can of whoop ass. And we know how that war terminated. So that was my first interest really in the military, and because I was enamored with this Doolittle raid, I really started to focus on World War II initially, and specifically the Pacific Theater. And of course, who was romping and stomping across the Pacific but United States Marines? And that's where I first gained an interest in becoming a Marine. And truth and advertising, I originally loved World War II aviation, the Doolittle flying B 25 Mitchells and the old F4F Wildcats and the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal. But if I could have flown an F4U Corsair, I might have become a pilot, but I was really attracted to the regular, tough, gritty Marine Corps infantrymen landing across enemy beaches and fighting it out mano a mano with Japanese Imperial soldiers and Marines to see who was going to be left holding that island at the end of the day.
Yeah, I had John Bruning on my podcast a couple months ago. He wrote a book, 53 Days on Starvation Island, basically focusing in on those Marine aviators during the Battle of Guadalcanal. And just so, I mean, the level of courage that it took for these guys, I mean, in the Pacific Theater during World War II, this was some of the most brutal fighting in world history, I think. It's just
It's
these
an
guys
incredible story.
these guys don't get enough praise. They deserve more praise than they get. But speaking to the Doolittle raids and the courage there, these guys, when they went on these bombing raids, they didn't expect to get home, right? Their plan was to bomb Japan and then drop out over China, right?
Yeah, they were going to ditch in China and then find their way home if they could. And unfortunately, many of them did not make it home.
It's just incredible. And that's see, this is the importance of studying history. And this is one of the reasons, well, the main reason why I started this podcast. I'm 22, part of Gen Z, and something that I see that you were speaking to earlier is my colleagues in my generation and really Americans as a whole just don't understand the sacrifice that our ancestors before us have gone through in order for us to be the greatest country in the world. And I do feel that I have some sort of cosmic mission. I have this torch passed down from me, from my ancestors, to tell their stories so that they're not forgotten.
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the principal reasons why I wrote Washington's Marines, because that's a story that needs to be told. It we don't want our history to be lost. We want to refresh our understanding of it and put it in the context of what we're dealing with today. So again, we don't repeat the mistakes that were made in the past, and we have learned those valuable lessons that people had to learn the hard way back in the day.
100%. And that segues perfectly into my next question. What was the moment when you felt compelled to tell the story of the origin of the Marine Corps?
Well, as a Marine, history and tradition are extremely important to us. In fact, we refer to it as being a force multiplier on the battlefield because understanding all of that sacrifice that we've been talking about, that our forefathers went through, that our fathers, our grandfathers, and our great great grandfathers have done in wars past, we are unwilling to let their legacy down. We understand that we have a role to play today in order to keep that history alive and to write that next chapter of our great nation's history, and for Marines, for the next chapter of Marine Corps history. And so I had this as a Marine, we're all a bit of historians at large, and we have to study and celebrate our history and our traditions. And we do that in many different ways throughout the year. For example, the Marine Corps cake cutting ceremony, celebrated by Marines every November 10th, anywhere they are in the world, whether they're in peace or war, whatever their conditions are, we pause to celebrate the birth of our Corps, which happened on November 10th, 1775. We're older than the nation we defend, and that's covered in the book there, and why that was so important. So, really, I also understand that there's a lot of myth and folklore concerning our history. And so I really wanted to deep dive into primary sources to really find out what the real story was about the birth of the Corps, why it was created to begin with, where it was created, who our first Marines were, what their backgrounds were. And it was an extraordinary journey and really like a treasure hunt, because once you start digging into those primary sources, you see all these connecting files and you find out, well, that really wasn't true. The things that I've believed my whole career, this is the reality. And oh, by the way, there's a connecting file to this other thing that I never knew about the Marine Corps. And Marines don't know today that they need to know, because that history is so important to us.
Wow, that's so cool. So what was that research process like? I'm always interested to talk with authors who have, written these comprehensive books. This book here, it's obviously very well researched. I'm sure you spent a lot of time on it, but what was that research process like? You say that you actually found a couple of beliefs that you had that were sort of missed that you corrected for yourself?
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example about the birth of the Corps. Why were we even created? So the Continental Congress adopted the militia forces outside of Boston, holding the British under siege after Lexington and Concord, and made George Washington the commander in chief in June of 1775. Uh, Although Washington was able to hold the British under siege from the landward side of Boston, the United States didn't even exist at the time. We were still 13 independent colonies when the conflict began, and we had no navy. And the British had the most powerful navy in the world. So inevitably, what could happen is the British could reinforce and resupply themselves from sea, even though we had them barricaded in and under siege from the landward side. So, in order to create a stopgap before we could create our own navy, we started using private vessels that we converted into warships. And we did that in two different, well, really three different ways. The first was that we created privateers. And privateers is an age old practice in which governments sanction civilians to basically be pirates and go out there and capture enemy ships and then sell what they capture as prizes or use those materials that they get to support their own military. So we had privateer industry picking up at the beginning of the war. Then we also had different colonies creating their own navies in order to protect their own ports and their own seaboards, because the eastern seaboard is really where the economy flourished. It was all about trade, and if we were barricaded or blockaded by the Royal Navy and couldn't get our goods out to trade, it would stifle and stagnate our economy, which means we couldn't support a war. And then the final thing was we had local generals, in this case, General Washington and Benedict Arnold up on Lake Champlain, that out of necessity created their own local navies and used soldiers to fight as sailors and as Marines, because we had no Navy or Marine Corps to speak of at this point. But in no, and so Rhode Island was the first colony to call for the establishment of a navy. And the catalyst for doing that was we caught an intelligence report that said there were British ships coming from England to reinforce the British in Quebec. And so the Continental Navy assigned George Washington with purchasing two merchant vessels, converting it into warships. And these would be the two first ships of the American Navy, still now referred to as the Continental Navy because we were still not the United States. Washington balked at that. He said, "Hey, there's no ships up here because they're all going off to be privateers for their own self-interest and their own winning of prize money." And so he recommended that the Continental Navy look further south. And in fact, the first Navy fleet was created in Philadelphia, where 5 merchant ships were purchased and converted into warships. So they now had an army, they had a navy that was created on October 13th, 1775, but we still didn't have Marines until the Continental Congress. And this is the history that Marines don't know. Why was the Marine Corps created? Not just for service with the fleet, but initially it was because the Continental Congress received a letter from the civil government in Passamaquoddy, Nova Scotia, which was part of Canada. And they wrote to Congress and they said, "We are interested in joining this coalition of forces that are fighting for their freedoms against the mother country." And they asked to be part of the North American consortium, if you will, that was fighting against the British. And so the Continental Congress started to salivate. They started thinking this is an opportunity to pull in Canada as the 14th colony of the American colonies. And the people of Passamaquoddy, because they were on Nova Scotia, understood that Halifax, Nova Scotia, was the principal Royal Navy base of operations for the North American fleet. And they recommended that we create a naval campaign in order to capture Halifax, which would stifle Royal Navy operations on the eastern seaboard. So there was a group of three that included John Adams, our future president, John Langdon from New Hampshire, and Silas Deane from Connecticut, who met in the second story room of a tavern in downtown Philadelphia referred to as Tun Tavern. And they were referred to as the Marine Committee, and they were a committee underneath the Continental Congress, and they were tasked with coming up with a plan on how to conduct this naval campaign to capture Halifax. And they created their plan on the 9th of November, and on the 10th of November, they briefed the full Congress. And on the 10th of November, the Continental Congress resolved to create 2 battalions of Continental Marines that would be referred to as the 1st and 2nd Battalion of American Marines. And that was the rationale for the creation of the Marine Corps, to capture Halifax, Nova Scotia, not for service with the fleet initially. And in the resolution, they further went on to assign George Washington with being the one to create these 2 battalions of Marines. And the way he was supposed to do that was to cherry pick soldiers from the Army who had seafaring experience and assign them to create these 2 battalions of Marines. Well, George Washington looked at that and he goes, "You got to be flipping kidding me. I'm trying to create an army out of these ragtag militia forces from the 4 New England colonies. I don't have the bandwidth to be able to create these Marines. I don't have the manpower to create that." And then the Congress further went on and said, "And oh, by the way, George, you're going to lead the naval expedition to capture Halifax." He's like, "I have my hands full right here in Boston. I can't do that." Well, John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress at the time. He said, "Okay, slow down, George. You're off the hook. You don't have to lead this expedition to Nova Scotia, and you don't have to create these 2 battalions of Marines. But we believe that it's very important to have men that can fight on the land and the sea. So we're still going to create these Marines, and we're going to do it so they can serve with the fleet using the Royal Marines from the Royal Navy as a model for how they would do that and how they would serve the fleet." And so George Washington was off the hook, and the Continental Congress took it upon themselves to create the Continental Marines on their own.
Wow. What a story. That's funny. Old George had his hands full, and as the war would progress, he definitely didn't have the bandwidth to be, redirecting his energies, especially after the New York campaign. After his army was battered. But the United States Marine Corps is born. And going back to something you said earlier that I would like to touch on, just an interesting thought that I had. The Marine Corps celebrates the birthday of the Marines every year, whether in peacetime or in war. What is the birthday celebration of the Marines like during war, on the front lines? Like, for example, in World War II, with these guys island hopping on the front lines in the jungle, they're still celebrating the birthday. What does that look like?
Well, I'll tell you what it looked like for me being a Marine in war. And so we have our pre prepared meals, field rations, if you will, and we call them meals ready to eat. And one of the items that came in that is a pound cake. And you would tear out the foil and you would push it out, and it'd be like it almost looked like a piece of bread, but it was actually pound cake. So we took that pound cake and we took matches from a book of matches that came in the MRE, and we stuck the matches in the pound cake like it was candles. We lit the matches and we sang happy birthday to the Marine Corps. And part of the ceremony is that we're supposed to read a message from General John A. Lejeune, who was our commandant in 1921, when he made it a law for Marines to have to do this every year to recognize the birth of our Corps. And so we always have a copy of General Lejeune's message available. We read the message, we cut the cake, and the tradition is that you first give the first piece of cake to your guest of honor if you have one, but if not, you give the next piece of cake to the oldest Marine present. And that is in recognition of their years of experience, their skill, their knowledge, and the history and tradition of the Corps. And then that oldest Marine hands that piece of cake to the youngest Marine present. And that symbolizes the passing of that knowledge and history and tradition from one generation down to the next. And then the youngest Marine eats their piece of cake, and then everyone else gets a piece after that. So that practice, in its most simplistic and basic terms, happens in fighting holes. It happens on the flight line. It happens at on ships at sea. Wherever you may be, whatever your circumstances are, you're going to pause and recognize the birth of our great Corps. And again, that is a combat multiplier because it's that unity that exists in the Marine Corps that makes us fight harder. We refuse to let those who went before us down. We refuse to blemish the legacy of our great Corps.
Wow, what a cool ceremony. And saying force multiplier is such an interesting point because you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. You're not just out there on the battlefield for self-preservation. There's so much tradition and rich history that goes behind these ceremonies. That's so important. And speaking of Lejeune, one of my very first episodes on this podcast I did about Major Pete Ellis, who is one of his proteges, who is kind of considered the father of the modern Marine Corps in a way.
Yes, so Pete Ellis was a bit of a maverick and was out there advocating for amphibious warfare in a post World War I environment. And one of the things that's important about history as well is if you're an active military force, your responsibility is to be prepared to win the next war, not the one you just fought. And so post World War I, that was really the birth of the modern day Marine Corps, because that's the first time we went from just fighting for the fleet and, well, other than when we were assigned to George Washington during the American Revolution, but really for from 1775 all the way until 1918, we were very closely tied to the fleet. But the national crisis, the global crisis that existed with the World War, required Marines to go ashore and fight as a protected land force, if you will, and that was the modern day arrival of the Marine Corps. And so a lot of leaders that fought in that war believe that that's the way we should continue to hone our skills for future wars, is to be able to fight as part of the army. But Pete Ellis advocated for not doing that for developing amphibious doctrine to be able to fight a different type of war, which is the war that we eventually did fight in World War II. And that really gave the Marine Corps a name and a history that nothing can touch today.
Yeah, he was an interesting character, but kind of proved himself to be a visionary uh, of the World War II operation. So let's get into Washington's Marines now. The two navies heading into the war, obviously very different. The United States, the colonies didn't even really have a navy. The Royal Navy is one of the most powerful forces in the world. This committee creates the Marine Corps, 2 battalions of Marines to be raised. So what basically is step number one after Congress declares 2 battalions of Marines to be raised? What's sort of the first process in building this Marine Corps?
Well, in order to build a Marine Corps, you have to recruit it. And so they started out with commissioning the first Marine officer in November of 1775, and he was actually identified prior to the creation of the Marine Corps. He was first identified on the 5th of November, and his commission was signed by John Hancock on the 29th of November. And that gentleman's name was Samuel Nicholas. And Nicholas actually was a tavern owner in Philadelphia, and he owned a tavern called the Conestoga Wagon. And he was very prominent in Philadelphia society. So he received the commission with two other officers as the first three Marine Corps officers. And their first task was to go out and recruit Marines, enlist them into the Marines. And they did that throughout Philadelphia. And many people mistakenly, and this is one of the myths of the Marine Corps that gets debunked, is many people refer to Samuel Nicholas as the first commandant of the Marine Corps for the reasons that I stated. In fact, if you go into the Marine Corps hallway in the Pentagon, it even has a painting of Samuel Nicholas and identifies him as first commandant. But that's absolutely incorrect. And the reason for that is because the Congress did not formally bestow the term commandant on the senior Marine until 1790 with William Barrow, well after the end of the American Revolution. Regardless, Samuel Nicholas was the first and senior most Marine officer, and he and John Shoemaker and John Welsh went out through the wharfs and the bars and taverns of Philadelphia and went and enlisted their first Marines. Now, the difference here is when John Hancock gave Washington the bye on not conducting this amphibious assault and naval campaign to capture Halifax, because we didn't have the ships to do it, we didn't have the 2 battalions to do it, they never did recruit two full battalions of Marines. What they did was they changed the model in order to have each ship of the Continental Navy have a company of Marines assigned to them, and they would also be known as the ship's detachments. And they would serve several roles on board ship. They would be responsible for the good order and discipline of the ship. They would protect the captain. They would fight from the fighting tops and snipe down at enemy forces on the opposing ship. They would provide boarding parties to capture enemy ships. And then they could conduct limited operations ashore in support of naval campaigns. And the way they would do that is either an individual company of Marines from one ship would go and conduct a small operation, or if they needed to do something larger, they could combine several companies from several ships and create a battalion of Marines in order to conduct a land campaign of limited duration. And that's, in fact, what the first Marines did with the first American fleet in March of 1776. So, as the first fleet of five converted merchant ships formed in Philadelphia in January of 1776, the Continental Congress gave orders to a gentleman named Isaac Hopkins, who became the first admiral of the Navy, and he was actually referred to as the commander in chief of the Navy, just like Washington was commander in chief of the Army. he was the first and final commander in chief of the Navy because in 1778 he would be cashiered from the service, and they never used that term again. But what the Continental Congress assigned Hopkins with doing was basically protecting the eastern seaboard, which the British and Royal Navy now had under blockade. And so his orders basically said, you are to immediately go down to Virginia and find, seek out, and destroy the British fleet that is operating in the Virginias. And if that was not enough, once that was complete, they were then to go to the Carolinas, find, seek out, and destroy the fleet operating off of the Carolinas. And then once that was done, he was supposed to shoot up to New England and take on the British fleet, blockading the New England colonies as well. And think about this. This is the most powerful navy in the world that are manning frigates and men of war, ships of the line built as warships from the keel up. And the largest American ship at the time was called the Alfred, and it only manned 24 9-pound cannons. The British had ships that had up to 100 cannons on them, all the way up to 32 pounders. So Hopkins is looking at this and he goes, you got to be flipping kidding me. You know, we just formed the Navy in Philadelphia a few months earlier, and this is their inaugural cruise. They've never rehearsed together, they never operated together. And so he continues reading his orders, and there's a caveat in there. And it says, oh, by the way, if the weather doesn't permit or some other unforeseen complication occurs, use your best judgment in what you do with the fleet. Well, Hopkins had earlier received an intelligence report that George Washington was critically short of gunpowder, holding the British under siege, which was true, because in fact, he only had enough gunpowder to provide each army soldier with 9 rounds to shoot. That was it. If the British knew that, they could have assaulted and they would have wiped out the Continental Army at that point. But Hopkins heard that the British had stockpiles of gunpowder being stored down in the Bahamas, specifically at an island called New Providence. And there were 2 bases down in New Providence, Fort Nassau and Fort Matangau, that were holding this gunpowder. So Hopkins thought about it and he goes, you know what? I am not going to go be defeated against these 3 British fleets. I'm going to go get the gunpowder that Washington needs, and I'll come back up being a hero, bringing all these critically needed supplies. So he sets sail, goes 1,000 miles south to the Bahamas, and en route, he has 2 officers on his flagship, the Alfred. And one of them is a first lieutenant named John Paul Jones, who would become very well known in Navy lore. And the company commander for the Marine detachment on the Alfred was Samuel Nicholas, the most senior Marine. So en route down south, Hopkins pulls Samuel Nicholas in and says, I want you to create a battalion of Marines by combining all of the Marine detachments on board the 5 ships of the Navy, and you're going to conduct an amphibious assault and capture this gunpowder. Well, Hopkins winds up pushing his fleet too close to the shore, and he gets spotted and alerts the British on New Providence before the Marines can land. So he adds 50 sailors to the landing force, and there were 234 Marines and 50 sailors. They conduct the first amphibious assault, and they capture Fort Matangau on the first day of their naval campaign. The following day, they move forward and they capture Fort Nassau. The British militia that was supposed to be guarding the fort basically ran in fear when they saw the Marines coming. So although there was very limited fire, only 3 cannons were fired at the Marines from Fort Matangau. No casualties. The Marines capture 88 cannons and mortars. Unfortunately, Hopkins did not effectively block the port with his ships, so much of the gunpowder was evacuated before the Marines captured Fort Nassau, but they actually captured more cannons than a gentleman named Henry Knox, who went to Fort Ticonderoga to bring cannons back to George Washington to lift the siege of Boston. He only brought like 65 cannons with him. So the Marines captured more cannons. They loaded up the Continental Fleet. They brought those cannons up, but they didn't get into the area until after George Washington had already successfully forced the British to evacuate Boston using the cannons that Henry Knox brought from Fort Ticonderoga. And that name Knox is going to matter here in our coming discussion.
Yeah, 100%. That's such an incredible story. It's crazy that that siege in the Bahamas isn't taught as much. I mean, I'm very familiar with Knox and his little operation at Ticonderoga, but upon coming across your work, I had never heard of this operation down in the Bahamas, which was even more prevalent than Knox's to Ticonderoga. But specifically, John Paul Jones, I feel a special connection to him because I have had the pleasure of going and visiting the Naval Academy where his crypt is under the chapel there, and that was a pretty incredible experience to be able to witness that. John Paul Jones, obviously a legendary figure, um, and his famous words, "I have not yet begun to fight." But this is really the first operation of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Wow, and it was a that's incredible and a resounding success. Really sets the tone for the future of the Marine Corps. But as the war progresses, originally they're attached to the naval vessels, sort of as a supplement to the Navy. Did the Marine Corps' role evolve as the war went on?
Well, generally speaking, they were tied to the fleet throughout the war, with a couple of rare exceptions. And one of those was in December of 1776. After the fleet returned from their raid in New Providence, it went and operated in New England waters predominantly, although they also operated out of Philadelphia as individual ships. But the fleet never really functioned as a cohesive fleet after that for several different reasons. That's another topic for another discussion. But Samuel Nicholas was released from the Alfred to go from Rhode Island, where the fleet was anchored, to Philadelphia to carry the dispatches to report to the Continental Congress on the success of the raid. And when he did that, they promoted him from captain to major, and he wanted to return to his company on board the Alfred, and they denied him in doing that. And the reason for that is because he had another recruiting effort to lead. Because in December of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the construction of the first 13 frigates for the United States Navy, which would be the first ever warships built from the keel up for that purpose. And construction of those 13 frigates was spread across some of the major ports of the eastern seaboard. And four of them were going to be built in Philadelphia. So the Continental Congress assigned Samuel Nicholas with now leading the recruiting effort in order to man these companies for the four frigates being built in Philadelphia. And one of the people that they commissioned at that time was a gentleman named Robert Mullen. And Robert Mullen was actually the owner of Tun Tavern, where the Marine Committee met on the second story to come up with the plan to create the Marines. So, this is why a lot of people mistakenly call the Marine Corps' birthplace Tun Tavern. But that Robert Mullen did not become a Marine officer until a year later in 1776, not 75 when the Marine Corps was created. The real reason Tun Tavern's the birthplace of the Corps is because the Marine Committee was meeting in that second story room at Tun Tavern a year before Mullen received his commission. But it is true that once Mullen received his commission, he hired two brothers, one as a drummer and one as a fifer, and they toured the streets of Philadelphia with a drum with a coiled rattlesnake on it, said, "Don't tread on me," or "tread on me." And they were playing martial music to attract people into Tun Tavern. And that's where they would set up the recruiting station. And let's say probably got people a little inebriated along the way and helped convince them to have the courage to sign on to go fight the British. But Robert Mullen was made one of the four company commanders of those four frigates that were being built in Philadelphia. And as you mentioned earlier, General Washington, once the siege in Boston was complete, he shifted the army to New York, believing that that would be the next target of the British. And in fact, it was. And the British showed up with 32,000 soldiers, to include Hessian mercenaries from the German provinces. And Washington at the time had 19,000 militiamen and the initial soldiers that were recruited to serve in the Continental Army. But they were still neophytes. They didn't really know what they were doing. Washington was defeated in battle after battle. He was pushed out of New York. He lost Manhattan Island. He lost the Battle of Long Island. He moves over the Hudson River into New Jersey. And then Lord Howe basically takes him under pursuit from northern New Jersey all the way until he crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 8th, 1776, using the Delaware River now as a natural obstacle where the British can no longer pursue him, because Washington had the foresight to have all the boats on the river for 70 miles from Philadelphia north collected, so they had no way to cross. So Washington now realizes he needs to seek the initiative and seize the initiative back from the enemy. But his problem is he no longer has the manpower he once had. The 19,000 soldiers he started the New York campaign with had dwindled down to only 2,500 with him in Pennsylvania. And there were some other scatterings of Continental forces still in New York under General Lee and General Gates. But Washington knew that this was a critical point in the revolution, because the British were either going to bring boats down, cross the river, and defeat the army. And if they defeated the army, they defeated the entire revolution. Or they were going to wait for the Delaware River to freeze over and then just cross over the ice. He didn't have a lot of time to operate. He went to the Continental Congress. He said, I need your assistance. They gathered whatever militia forces they could in the area to support Washington. One of those groups were called the Philadelphia Associators, initially created by Benjamin Franklin during the French and Indian War, but they were reinstituted during the start of the American Revolution, and they were under a gentleman named John Cadwalader, whose name will matter here in a moment. Cadwalader goes to Trenton to link up with Washington, but there was already another group waiting there, and that was a battalion of Continental Marines. Because what occurred is, because of Washington's dire straits, the Continental Congress assigned Samuel Nicholas with pulling the Marine companies, the Marine detachments, off of those four frigates and creating a battalion of Marines by combining those four companies to go assist Washington and the Continental Army. In essence, what they did was they detached him from the Navy and they attached the Marines to the Continental Army under General Washington. So they load in gondolas, they go up the Delaware River, and they're outside of Trenton to fight for Washington and the Continental Army. But Washington's only recollection of Marines is that they were those dirty buggers who were trying to draw resources off of my army, and I didn't want any part of them. And so he turns to Cadwalader, who he assigns as a brigadier general, and he says, Cadwalader, go talk to Nicholas and the Marines and find out whether they mean to fight on the water or on the land, because there were Continental forces fighting on the Delaware River as well. There was Pennsylvania and New Jersey Navy fighting on the Delaware, as well as a couple of Continental smaller ships. And he said, no, General, they're here to fight for you and the Army. And Washington says, very well, sir, I place them under your command, as a separate and distinct battalion. So the battalion of Continental Marines fought as an additional battalion assigned to the Philadelphia Associators for what would become known as the 10 crucial days that included the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Assunpink Creek, and the Battle of Princeton. And I'll pause there.
Wow, what a story. Okay,
And that
so
was the Marines' first protracted land campaign in our history.
and quite an important one. A lot of people refer to the Battle of Saratoga, rightfully so, as the turning point of the American Revolution, but I think that the true turning point of the revolution is the Battle of Trenton and these crucial 10 days that you referred to. And that is something that is a hill that I will die on. That the true turning point of the American Revolution is here, these crucial 10 days. So the stage is set for the Battle of Trenton, Washington's infamous and very well known crossing of the Delaware to surprise the Hessians at Trenton. So from here, how does the Battle of Trenton play out? What is the Marines' role in the campaign?
Yeah, so Washington created a fairly complex plan that included four different elements. He led the main effort element, which consisted at the time about 2,400 troops that crossed Delaware River at McConkey's Ferry, and then they did a 9-mile forced march to attack the Hessians at Trenton from the north and from the west. But in order to enable that success there at Trenton, he established three other supporting efforts. The first one was there was a group of Pennsylvania and New Jersey militiamen who were supposed to cross the river right at Trenton and capture a bridge on the south side of Trenton to block any Hessians from escaping as Washington attacked with the main force. The second support effort was further downriver at an area near Burlington and Bordentown, and that consisted of the Philadelphia Associators and the Continental Marines. Their task was to cross the Delaware River and establish a blocking position to prevent any other reinforcements coming to reinforce the Hessians that Washington was engaging in Trenton proper. And actually, the colonel in charge of the Hessians in Trent was a guy named Rahl, and his boss was a guy named Von Donop. And Von Donop and his brigade were further downriver, and that's who the Marines and the Associates were supposed to block from making their way back to Trenton. And then a third group consisted of militiamen that was supposed to cross in the vicinity of Philadelphia over to the New Jersey side to try and fix any British or Hessian forces in that area. The problem was that night, a nor'easter rolled in and created very dangerous conditions on the river. So Washington's force was actually the only one of the four elements that successfully made it across the river. And if you went further downriver, that group that was supposed to cross at Trenton proper, the entire Delaware River was filled with ice cakes and spiked ice and very dangerous conditions for them to be able to try and cross. And then where the Marines and the Associators were, they actually got 2/3 of their force across the river and into New Jersey. But then the ice started forming on the banks of the river, making it impossible for the Associators to land their artillery. And because of that, and because of the risk of not having that support, Callwalder aborted the mission and made those who were already in New Jersey cross back over into Pennsylvania. And then that final force never got across the river. Well, the following morning, Callwalder is on the Pennsylvania side and he's writing a letter to General Washington basically saying, hey, I'm sorry nobody made it successfully across the river. I recommend we consolidate at my location and we cross today once the conditions were better. And as he's writing this letter, all of a sudden he hears boom, boom, boom. Here's all these cannon fire coming from the position of Trenton. And then he looks across the river and he sees Haitians beating feet out of the area in full retreat. And he's son of a gun. He didn't realize Washington had made it across the river successfully and was in the attack. Well, the Marines and the Associators are now fired up. They're like, hey, we got to get over there and join the fight. So that following day, they actually do successfully cross over into New Jersey and they establish themselves on the New Jersey shore. Unbeknownst to them, after the Battle of Trenton was complete, Washington now had about 1,000 Hessian prisoners with him, and he knew that General Howe had about 10,000 British soldiers just a few hours north of him. So he wisely made the decision to cross back into Pennsylvania. So he crosses back into Pennsylvania. Now Cadwalader and the Marines are over in New Jersey. He's in Pennsylvania. And then word got to Cadwalader that Washington was over there, and he decides he wants to abort the mission again and come back into Pennsylvania, but the Marines are having none of it, and they say, "Bull crap! We're here. We're in the fight. The Hessians are in full retreat. Let's go see who we can capture." So they start attacking upriver towards Trenton, and they take von Donop's force, who is now trying to retreat to Brunswick and to Princeton. They're trying to chase them down to see who they can capture. And Cadwalader writes to Washington and says, "Hey, there's no force here that you need to worry about. They're all in full retreat. Recommend you cross back over into New Jersey," which he does over the next coming days. Now, Washington is now back over the river with the Marines, with the Associators, and he knows that Lord Cornwallis, who was trying to go home to winter with his wife in England, got recalled from the ship before he set sail, and Howe puts him in charge of a 10,000 man force to move south from Brunswick and Princeton to finally defeat the Continental Army in the vicinity of Trenton. So Washington now takes the opportunity for the first time to consolidate all of these forces that were at these four different locations into one cohesive force. And he establishes a strong defensive position on the south side of the Assunpink Creek, which crosses the south side of Trenton, with one key bridge as the key crossing point, and uses that natural terrain as a barrier that the British are going to have to overcome. He sends Edward Hand and a delaying force up north to Princeton that does a fight and retreat to buy Washington time to get all of these forces consolidated. And once he sets up this strong defensive position, he puts the Associators and the Marines on the right flank of the main force to protect any envelopment that the British may try and do. The British show up right at the end of the day at dusk, and they try to successfully force the bridge. But Henry Knox now has 40 cannons and Continental forces covering the bridge, and they repulse the first British attack. But Washington identifies that this is their point of main attack, so he pulls the Marines in and brings them into that main part of the fight, guarding and protecting that bridge. The British and Hessians will try two more times that evening to force the bridge, but with the help of the Marines, they're repulsed every time. And the British now pull back to the high ground on the far end of Trenton to lick their wounds, and Washington is holding the ground still. And there's a wise general named Erskine on the British side that talks to Lord Cornwallis, and they say, "General, I recommend we attack now, because if you don't be surprised if Washington is not there in the morning." And Cornwallis kind of waves him off and says, "Don't worry about it. We'll bag the fox in the morning." Well, Washington now has to make a key decision. He won the day, but does he remain in place with the understanding that he's outnumbered 2-1 by the British, and they will probably eventually force the line? Or they'll conduct an envelopment attack further upriver and hit him in the flank, and then he's got no place to go because he can't cross the river under fire from the British. So he can attack the British and take the initiative, but he knows he's outnumbered 2-1 and probably get defeated. Or he can retreat and pull further downriver away from the British, but he knows that they'll just take him under pursuit and eventually force a battle in which he's still outnumbered 2-1. So he has to make a decision, and he makes the very courageous and bold decision to not do any of those things, but to attack deeper into enemy-held territory. So in the middle of the night, he uses deception by having a 400-man battalion of militia stoke the campfires and make a racket like they're digging in to defend that position from the next day. And then he quietly pulls his forces off the line and he moves 11 miles further deeper into enemy held territory, bypasses the British to attack the brigade of Brits that are holding Princeton in the British rear. And there's a chance encounter that following morning in which the lead elements of the Americans and the lead element of that British brigade, who were under orders to move south to join Cornwallis for the final assault against the Americans at Trenton, they have a meet engagement in which the lead elements of both the Americans and the British begin a battle. And there's a general named Hugh Mercer that starts that battle for the Americans, and he only sends 100 riflemen and 100 militiamen with muskets forward to engage the British, but the British outnumber them 3-1. And so Mercer is quickly overrun and he is bayoneted 13 times on the battlefield. The British think that he's George Washington because he's dressed as a general officer. But the associators and the Marines were down in this sunken road on the side of the creek that they were using to guide up to this position. They hear the gunfire start and they pull out of that low ground and they start to form on the battlefield with the associators on the left and the Marines on the right, and they charge towards the enemy. Unfortunately, they only get one round of volley fire off before Hugh Mercer's brigade is now in a full retreat and basically runs head on into the Marines and the associators, creating mass confusion under British fire. The British have 8 cannon firing at them. They're advancing with their regular forces, and this chaos created in the American lines forces them back 150 meters. Callwalder and Samuel Nicholas regain control of the force. They turn them around, and at that decisive moment is that picture you see on the cover of Washington's Marines sitting beside you. That is the decisive point where General Washington arrives on the scene and he says, counterattack. And the Marines and the associators do that. They charge into the British and they win the day. They basically overwhelm the British. The British go running in retreat, and the battle is won at this historic moment. And this is the third victory that the Americans achieve in 10-day time frame, forever known as the 10 crucial days and turning point of the revolution, because that victory emboldens the rest of the American colonies, and young men of military age go rushing to their recruiters to join the fight, and basically gives the Continental forces a big plus up in forces to be able to sustain the fight.
God, that is so incredible. I mean, you really know your stuff. That was very eloquently stated. What a comprehensive view of those 10 crucial days. This just hearing that just fills me with so much patriotism and pride. It really just jacks me up and makes me want to go fight for old General Washington. But that makes me think. I always think about this when I'm thinking about war. And you'll have no doubt a firsthand insight into this. What is it like to be a foot soldier on those front lines? Because when I'm thinking about Washington's crossing of the Delaware, for example, I mean, it's brutal. It's freezing cold. They're having to traverse through this icy river. They're walking through the snow miles and miles and miles at night. Some of them are barefoot. I think there's some anecdotes of bloody footprints in the snow. I mean, this is just absolutely brutal. The amount of resilience it takes to get through something like this, like we talked about earlier, fighting for something bigger than yourself. People fighting for self-preservation are not going to go through this type of stuff. So what is it like to be a foot soldier in situations like this? What's sort of going through your head?
Well, it's dirty, it's gritty, it's nasty, it's fearful, it's bloody, it's cold, it's wet, it's tiresome, it's hunger, it's all of that rolled up into one. But when you're at the point of battle, all of that goes away and the adrenaline kicks in and you're focused on accomplishing your mission. Whatever that mission is, defend that bridge, defeat the British force, establish a blocking position. You're focused on that mission and you're focused on the man on your left and your right because you have created an extremely tight bond with these people. And that is still the strength of the Marine Corps today. It is the shared hardship that we go through that creates an unassailable bond. And that in the Marine Corps, you don't join the Marine Corps, you earn the title Marine. Nothing is given to you for free. And that man to your left and to your right has earned that title as well. And once you become a Marine, that stays with you for life. And to our point earlier of fighting for something larger than self, the Marine Corps' motto is Semper Fidelis, and that is Latin for always faithful. And that means faithful to our God, faithful to our country, and faithful to our core. And when we say our core, we're talking about that man to your left and to your right. So when you're out there and you're tired, you're hungry, you're dirty, you're nasty, you're fearful, all you have to do is refocus on the mission and your fidelity to God, country, and core, and whatever at that moment resonates with you the most, that is what's going to help you persevere and be resilient on the battlefield.
There's nothing that creates a bond better than shared adversity, and you see this manifest in its highest form on the battlefield. I've never served. I'm not a member of the military, but I have experienced this on a much smaller form in high school football. You're in the locker room together. Football practice sucks, especially in Florida. Walking out on that hot turf, putting your pads on, it sucks. That shared adversity, it creates those bonds that are never broken. You can only imagine, as someone who's never served in the military, what that must be like on of those soldiers on the battlefield. It's incredible. But
Yeah,
I want to,
it's that on steroids.
yeah, exactly, on steroids. I want to speak to the relationship between the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps. And obviously, they have these joint operations. I'm sure they're a welcome reinforcement in some of these situations. But throughout all of the branches of the military's history, there's sort of this love hate relationship. And there's a lot of, funny jokes about it. It's very, real. But can you speak to this love hate relationship between the branches of the military?
Sure. Yeah, so what we're known as today is the joint force. And when we say joint, it means all of the military services. So the way we fight today, we fight as a combined armed force, which leverages the unique strengths and skills and capabilities of all the services. And we understand that we're much stronger when we fight together as a cohesive team. And that was actually written into law in 1986 called the Goldwater's Nichols Act, which forced us to fight as a joint force. And the reason for that is because before Goldwater's Nichols, there was a lot of parochialism that occurred between the military services. And what it comes down to is it comes down to resources, relevance, roles, missions, and pride and jealousies, quite frankly. So first of all, the Marine Corps has been under attack ever since George Washington said, heck no, I'm not going to create these Marines in 1775. And it's true. And there have been several presidents, oh, by the way, all of them former Army officers, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, that have tried to disestablish the Marines over time. And the reason for that is because they look at it as the large army, or the Navy looks at us as big Navy, or the Air Force who has their own planes, and they say, why do we have these Marines when we do everything they do and we do it better than them? Because the Marines do fight in all of the domains of warfare, but it comes down to roles and responsibilities. Ultimately, a lot of the fighting has to do with um, fighting for the limited defense dollars in order to be able to procure the equipment and the capabilities that the services need to accomplish their mission. And that's always in short supply, even though we have an extremely large defense budget. But the other part is over time where we had situations where we have fought in the same battles, but one service might have gotten a little bit more notoriety over the others. And I'll give you an example of this that still is a thorn in soldiers' side ever since World War One in 1918. There was a famous battle called the Battle of Belleau Wood. And this, again, as I mentioned earlier, was the coming of the modern day Marine Corps. And the Army looked at the Navy as the little brothers who just, we're the policemen of the Navy. We really don't have a role in ground warfare. But what happened in World War One was just like when Washington was so critically short of forces to conduct the 10 crucial days in those three battles, the Allied forces in World War One were critically short as well. And the Germans had a large offensive in 1918, and they broke through the trench lines and they were pushing towards Paris and were getting ready to capture Paris. And what happened was at that time, the army was the one that was fighting on the front lines, and they delegated the Marines to only guarding the mail in the rear and doing odd jobs and guard duties back in the rear. But just like Washington faced a crisis, the American army and the Allied armies facing a crisis as Paris was getting ready to be captured. And so they sent the Marines forward. And there's a very famous quote from a captain from 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines named John Williams. As the French were retreating out of the area, we showed up and we were running towards the sound of the guns. We finally got unleashed, the shackles taken off so we could go prove ourselves. And everyone else was retreating back towards Paris. And this French officer goes, "Retreat, retreat, where are you going?" And Captain Williams responds, "Retreat, hell, we just got here." And they went into the attack and they took on the British's crack forces, and we captured the woods, and then we defended it against several counterattacks. And the Marines fought so fiercely in that battle that the Germans said, "Who are these men? These men that fight like Teufelhundens, devil dogs." And that's where we earned that nickname that still holds true today. And in fact, there were three battles there: the Battle for Belleau Wood, which, by the way, the French renamed the whole woods the Woods of the Marines in respect for our fight and prowess there. And it was the Battle of Belleau Wood, the Battle of Cesson, and the Battle of Blanc-Manque that the Marines were awarded the French Gourget, or what we call the French Fourragette. And that is a gold, as you were, a forest green knotted braid that the fighting 5th and 6th Marine Regiments still wear today because of receiving that award during World War One. Well, that's huge in Marine Corps history. But what a lot of people don't recognize is that there were actually more soldiers in that battle than there were Marines. The problem was that the media was being censored at that time. And so the stories weren't getting out about the Americans' contribution. However, the reporter that was with the Marines got his story out, and he bypassed the proper channels, got his story out. So back in the United States, all the headlines said, "The Marines win the Battle of Belleau Wood." And it went down in Marine Corps history as one of our most famous battles, even though there were a lot more soldiers that participated and helped succeed in that battle as well. Well, that didn't sit well with a lot of senior Army officers who still hold that against us to this day. They think, and it was Harry S. Truman that said, the Marines have a better propaganda machine than the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. And the reason for that is because we have an institutional paranoia, because we're always having to defend ourselves in our existence when it comes down to defense budgets being cut and roles and responsibilities of the services being discussed in the halls of Congress.
Wow, that's such a funny story. What a quote by Truman. That's so funny. But yeah, the story of how they got the nickname Devil Dogs is truly incredible. But say you and your Marine buddies are in at the bar and a group of Army guys walk in. What does that confrontation look like?
Well, we'll jab at each other in good humor, but when push comes to shove, we're all part of the same joint force. We're both groups of Americans, and we'll fight each other, until someone else who's not Americans come in and want to mess with soldiers, and we'll come and fight for the soldiers as well. So like you said, love hate relationship, all very healthy, inter service rivalries going on. And quite frankly, like any good competition, to go back to your football days, that's a force multiplier too, because we have something to prove, and we will prove it. And there was a very famous study that was done in the 50s where the commandant went to one of our generals and he said, "General," and this is when we were fighting for roles and responsibilities in a post, well, during the Korean War, and he said, "Go out and find out why the nation needs a Marine Corps." Because we have an Army, Navy, and Air Force that do everything we do, and again, quite frankly, in many cases, can do it better than us. Why does the Marine Corps need its own Air Force? Why does the Marine Corps need its own landing craft? Why do they fight as an army? Why don't we just create more battalions in the Army instead of having a separate and distinct service in the Marine Corps? And the finding came back from a guy named General Krulak, and he said, "General, the nation does not need a Marine Corps, but the nation wants a Marine Corps. And that's why we still exist. And the reason there's a want of a Corps is because of institutionally what we stand for. We are unapologetic in the fact that we exist for three reasons: we make Marines, we win our nation's battles, and we return good citizens to America. And we succeed at everything we do. It's the ethos of the Corps. We refuse to fail. We refuse to surrender. If you got a crisis around the world, send in the Marines. They'll take care of it. And it's because of that professional reputation through years of sacrifice and service that the nation wants a Marine Corps. So it was actually written into law in the 1950s that the Marine Corps will exist for the rest of our American history, and we will always have 3 active battalions and 3 active air wings, and we will always be the most ready when the nation is least ready. Written into law by the 82nd Congress.
I think this is such an important point because I was listening to one of your earlier podcasts that you did, and I do think this is such an important point because I do think the Marines and the Marine Corps specifically is distinct among our military branches for the reasons that you just stated. And this really manifested itself in what you were talking about from your time as a recruiter, where you would be sitting down with recruits and you would do an exercise with them where you would say a word and tell them the first thing that comes to mind. Can you speak to that? Because I think that's so interesting and really speaks to what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. When you sit down with a group of Americans and you say, "We're going to play a word association game. Now I'm going to throw out a term and I want you to shout out the first image that comes to your mind." And I would say, "Are you ready?" And they go, "Yeah, we're ready." And I go, Navy. And people would say ships. And I'd say Air Force. And they say planes. And I say Army. And they say tanks or artillery. And then I say, "Are you ready for it?" Marine Corps. And the image that people have when you say Marine Corps is the image of an individual Marine, normally in a dress blue uniform. And then I would say, "Well, what's the difference between the services?" I said, "The difference is that our most precious asset in the Marine Corps is a living, breathing human being. It's not an inanimate hunk of metal like a tank, a plane, or a ship. So we invest everything we have in our people. We make them flexible, adaptable problem solvers that can overcome any challenge. There's no obstacle too great, no challenge too high that they cannot overcome, particularly when they are doing it as a team." And that's a mentality you have to have because you are going to be finding yourself in austere locations with no support other than the Marine on your left and your right and a Marine flying over you, because we fight as what's called a MAGTF, a Marine Air Ground Task Force. This is why the Marine Corps has its own Air Force. It's because we have 4 elements in a MAGTF. You have a command element that provides the command and control. You have a ground combat element that's going to fight on the ground, an air combat element, obviously in the air, and a logistics combat element providing the sustainment and resupply. So that allows us to be self mobile, self supporting with fires, and self sustaining with logistics. When we go in, we kick the door in and we open the door for the larger brothers and sisters in the Army, Navy, and Air Force to follow us. And we call that enabling operations. We enable the other forces to come in and bring the much heavier firepower that they have. But you need that initial kicking the door in from the Marines to be able to enable that.
100%. I hope any military age folks listening to this take that into consideration. Um, but going back to what we were talking about earlier with presidents, I think this is interesting. There, because I looked before this conversation, I looked up if any U.S. presidents had ever been a Marine, and there wasn't any. But with this upcoming election, we now have the vice president who was a former Marine. I'm not sure of other vice presidents, but is this the first time, an executive official has been a former Marine, and what does that mean to you?
Not the first time of an elected official. We have had several members of Congress, and there are still sitting several members of Congress that are Marines. But this is the first time in the executive branch, president or vice president, that we have a Marine. And just one word of correction there is there's no such thing as a former Marine. Once you earn the title, it stays with you for life. Now you can refer to him as a Marine veteran, but there are no such things as ex or former Marines.
Okay, well, I appreciate that correction.
Yeah, no problem. And Marines, we make that same mistake, so don't worry about it, Jake.
So what does it mean to you that JD Vance, a Marine, is going to be vice president?
Well, I think it's incredible, and the fact that he's actually an enlisted Marine and not an officer, I think, is all the better. Because I will take my parochial Marine hat off for a moment and say just the fact that he's a veteran is what matters most. This is an individual who volunteered as part of the all volunteer force to serve his country selflessly, to put others before self. And that's incredibly important. And there's been a lot of discussion over time about the fact that, we really do want an all volunteer force, not conscription, not a draft. But there are a lot of us who believe that it would be very prudent to have some type of service of our young men and women in our nation today to better the country or better their local communities, so they would have a greater appreciation of the freedoms and the liberties that those who volunteer to serve with the cloth of our nation are willing to sacrifice and defend. It's the very people that utilize those freedoms to the nth degree that will vilify the very freedoms and liberties that those of us in uniform defend as well. And that's okay to a point. But I think that we would have a lot less of those types of mentalities out there if everyone served our communities and our nation in some way, shape, or form.
I want to talk a little bit about your personal experience as a Marine. You are a Marine, but you served for 34 years. Was there ever any moment or event from your time serving as a Marine that had a particularly profound impact on you?
Yes, and I will say that there were certainly individual events in time that stand out, but the way I would answer that question is every opportunity that I had to lead Marines was profound in its own way. The joy, the satisfaction, the contentment, the purpose of serving beside men and women of honor and character every day and helping them to achieve their personal and their professional goals in life is extremely rewarding. In the Marine Corps, once you're a leader, and every Marine in the Marine Corps is a leader in some way, shape, or form, but when you're a leader, you are responsible for everything your people do or fail to do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't go home at the end of a hard day of work and not stop being a Marine. You are a Marine 24 and 7, and your actions and your words will reflect the Marine Corps. and your unit and its professional reputation, no matter where you are, what conditions are, what time of day it is. So we instill in our Marines that you are responsible for everything your people do or fail to do 24/7. And I remember having a conversation with one of my high school friends who went off to college and he became a business manager. And we were having lunch together one day, and he was sharing with me how he was having some problems with one of his employees who was having some personal issues at home, and it was bringing drama into the workplace. And so he was just going to have to fire her. And I was just thinking to myself, man, that sounds great, but how about helping that individual get through those personal challenges? How about helping them become better as an individual that can then help your team become better? Why don't you grow together? In the military, you don't have the choice to just fire people and get rid of them just because they have issues. You have to help them work through those issues. And it's so rewarding to be able to see these young people mature and become a better image of themselves, and be able to serve in positions of increased responsibility, and just seeing how that transforms their life, because we really do call it a transformation process in the Marine Corps. And that transformation process starts when you see your first recruiting poster or you talk to your first Marine. And then that starts to indoctrinate you into becoming a better image of yourself. And then it jump starts at either boot camp or officer candidate school, where you earn the title Marine. And when you're at boot camp or OCS, you're going to think that's the hardest stinking thing you've ever done in your life. But the reality is, it's child's play compared to what you're getting ready to do. You're going to be on this constant path of improvement throughout your life. That's the transformation process. It never ends. Whether you serve for 4 years or 40 years, you're continuing to grow every day. And we learn from each other. And I have just as much to learn from our most junior Marine as I do from my seniors.
That's so profound. Fulfillment at the highest degree. There's nothing that will give you a more powerful sense of fulfillment than doing hard things and accomplishing difficult tasks. But I want to speak to your transition to civilian life. How was that transition? And what sort of advice would you give to fellow veterans who struggle with that transition?
Yeah, great question. And I will tell you that I am blessed. And so, for those who don't know, my current position is I am the Dean of the Helm School of Government at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I did not come looking for this job. Okay. It was part of God's plan for me. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And so, the transition for me, it goes back to Semper Fidelis. If I'm always faithful to God, first and foremost, to our country and to our core, and the reason I stayed in the Marine Corps for 34 years is because I got to serve beside men and women of honor every single day. The transition for me to come to Liberty was seamless. And the reason for that is because in the Marine Corps, mission always comes first. We all understand that. At Liberty University, mission comes first. And the mission of Liberty is to train champions for Christ. And we do that by giving them a conservative Christian worldview, first and foremost, and then we teach them their vocation. That's no different than what we did in the Marine Corps. When you join the military, and you talk to a veteran out in town, and you ask him what'd you do in the military, most people will respond, "I was a tanker, I was a pilot, I was a surface warfare guy." When you ask that question of a Marine, the answer is, "I'm a Marine," not "I'm a grunt, I'm a pilot." No, it's you're a Marine. So first you build that foundation, and then you learn your military occupational specialty. And it's that institutional culture. So that same lifestyle, that same worldview has followed me to Liberty University. So I believe that I'm living a purpose-driven life, just like I did in the Marine Corps. I just changed my uniform, but I really feel like I've just moved on to my next assignment. And today I get to still serve beside men and women of honor and character. and that's incredibly rewarding. So to give advice to the veterans out there, because I have spoken to several friends that have had a more difficult time in transitioning, is you have to understand what's most important to you in life. Where does your loyalty lie? What purpose do you want to serve? What value do you want out of life? And then you have to pursue that. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people go for the money first and foremost. And then when they're working in corporate America, the defense industry, they find out they're like, this is not the same as it was in the Corps. I'm serving besides people whose loyalty is to their wallet, not to each other. And they find that to be less than satisfying, and they find a void in their life because that cohesion, that semper fidelis is missing. Well, you can still go, and I understand why some people have to work to make money because they have put kids through college, they have to pay mortgages. I understand that completely. I hope they can find employment where they can still find value and purpose in life and still put bread on the table. But the other thing I would recommend to veterans is get connected. There are a lot of veterans who get out and they're like, hey, I'm not dealing with that. I'm done with the green machine. I'm telling you, I have breakfast twice a month with a group of 12 Marines who get together at Cracker Barrel the first and third Thursday of every month. And we break bread together. And then at the end of the meal, we all stand up at the position of attention and we sing the Marines hymn loud and thunderously in the restaurant. And everybody shuts up. They all listen and then they all clap and applaud when we're done. I belong to the Marine Corps League in the local area where I get to serve again beside Marines serving our community. I belong to the American Legion to connect with all veterans, not just Marine veterans, and they're doing service to the community as well. We have a local Marine Corps Reserve Center here that is part of the community. We have 40,000 military students at Liberty University. And we have a student veteran association, which is led by a Marine corporal. He's the president of the student veteran association. So I've connected with all of these veterans. And as I said, once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine. So I'm still serving beside Marines every day. And so I don't feel that void. I don't miss that Semper Fidelis because I'm still connected, just in a different way, wearing a different uniform. So that would be my advice to the veterans out there.
No, that's amazing. I think it's so important to find like-minded individuals, individuals who share your values, who share, your purpose, and connect with them, because loneliness is the worst misery of all. It's so difficult to go through, especially difficult things alone. It's always better to find people who you can talk to find people who share, you know, your sense of values. But speaking to liberty, I'm a member of Young America's Foundation, a conservative organization. I'm the chairman of my chapter at the University of Central Florida, and I was at the recent conference in Washington D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of people from Liberty University there. So,
Yeah, they have a strong presence here.
yeah, they do. Speaking to that, what advice would you give to young people? What's sort of the biggest lesson or takeaway as a Marine that you would pass on to young people?
Well, this has been a life journey for me. And, I had the benefit of 56 years on this earth to come to this point. But I would encourage everyone, first and foremost, to accept God in your heart and to have a strong faith. And I'm not here to spout any specific religion, but I have my own religious beliefs. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. But it is that firm belief in God and having something greater than self to rely on to get through the most challenging times, to overcome your fears, to get through the fiery trials of life, because they're going to come. You are going to face enormous challenges in your life. And right now, our mental health, I would call it an endemic because epidemic, because there are so many people dealing with mental health challenges today that I firmly believe that if they had an alternative to medication. And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that need medication. I know people that that's a very real thing. I'm not advocating getting off medication if your doctors have prescribed that for you. But I do also know people that have been taken off of medication because they have found faith, and that has been enough for them. And the most difficult challenges I've had, it's been that I've relied on first and foremost. So I would start with that, start with a belief in God and having a strong faith foundation in order to go forward in life once you determine what your vocation is. And I'll tell you what my father told me. He said, follow your passion. Make sure that the vocation that you choose is something that you are passionate about because you will be most successful at it. Don't go after targets that are somebody else's dream for you. Go after your own dreams and give it your all in achieving the goals that you establish for yourself in life. Nothing in life is free. And unfortunately, we've created this entitled society today where people believe they deserve just because they exist. And that's just not reality. So work hard to achieve your goals in life. Put God first, and if you can combine those two things, you're going to be successful in life.
100%. That's wonderful advice. I wholeheartedly agree. Once you put your belief in God, He truly does become the bedrock of your life. Once you put your trust in God's plan, things become a little more peaceful. But Jason, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Thank you so much for your service to our great nation, protecting our freedom. Thank you for doing the work you're doing, illuminating our important history. What are you working on currently, and where can people find your work?
Well, I've been very fortunate to go with a publisher called Savas Beatty, who publish Washington's Marines, and they publish military history with a focus on Civil War and American Revolution, although they publish other things. And I am currently working on the next chapter of Washington's Marines, and I'm going to call it America's Marines, and it's going to fill in the rest of the story of the American Revolution all the way up from 1775 to 1779, and it's going to focus on the war at sea. And so it's going to talk about Marines fighting with the fleet from 75 up to 79 in the first half of the book. In the second half, just like Washington's Marines focused on the 10 crucial days and the Marines' contribution to that, the second part of America's Marines will focus on the Penobscot expedition of 1779. And this, again, is extraordinary history that Americans don't know. When the British evacuated Boston, once Washington got the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to force them out, they evacuated to Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia translates to New Scotland, just like New England. And Nova Scotia had become the hub for all expats, loyalists who were forced out of the colonies when the American Revolution began, but it didn't have the infrastructure or the economy to house that many people that were showing up unexpectedly. So the British looked for a solution in what was then northern Massachusetts, today is part of modern day Maine, and it was called Penobscot Bay. And the British actually invaded Penobscot Bay, established a fort called Fort George on a peninsula called Castine, and the intent was to create a new colony called New Ireland. So you have New England, New Scotland, and now New Ireland. And Massachusetts uh, created its own naval campaign in order to try and oust the British out of their territory because the Continental forces were now focused in the southern colonies in the southern campaign. And there were three Continental ships that were in Boston Harbor at the time, the Warren, a frigate, the Providence, and the Hampton, that became part of this expedition, which was then led by the CO of the frigate Warren, became the Commodore of the largest American fleet assembled during the American Revolution. We had 42 vessels that went to go do this naval campaign, and the ground force was led by an Army militiaman from Massachusetts. And they went up to do this naval campaign, and it became the greatest naval defeat in American history, all the way up for 164 years until the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. We lost every one of the 42 ships that participated in the operation. However, the only shining parts and the only success attributed to this entire expedition was when the Continental Marines led the effort. They successfully captured an island held by the British. They did an amphibious assault and assaulted up a 200 to 300 foot cliff to capture the southern portion of the peninsula. The British commander had his hand on the lanyard, ready to pull the flag of surrender because of the aggressiveness of the Marines. And right at that critical point, the militia army general said, "Cease all, we're going to bring the fort under siege." They had victory in their hands, and that decision bought the British enough time to have a reinforcement come down from New York with a fleet and additional soldiers. And because the fleet had never fought together as a cohesive force, and the commander, the commodore of the naval force, didn't have a backbone, they basically scuttled all the ships. It was every man for themselves. A couple of ships got captured, and they burned the rest up the Penobscot River. But again, the only shining light of that battle or that expedition was when the Continental Marines led the effort. So that's a story that needs to be told as well. And Americans don't know about it because it was a huge defeat. So nobody wanted to remember that history.
No, it sounds like an incredible story. I am very much so looking forward to it. But Jason, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for everything, Jake. I'm honored to be part of your podcast, and I'm very encouraged by the fact that you're doing this, particularly at a young age. We need more Americans like you, my friend.
I appreciate that.
All right. God bless and semper fidelis.